want to use this handout to think about the similarities and differences between the Jewish canon, which you can also call the Tanakh, an acronym for Torah, Nevi'im, or prophets, and Ketuvim, or writings. Okay, and then as we have discussed in class already, we can call this the Hebrew Bible. If we call it the Hebrew Bible, that tells us specifically that we're talking about the text in Hebrew and not a translation, whether it's to the vernacular, the everyday language of Jews or Christians, or whether it's to an authoritative translation, which in antiquity was Greek, or called the Septuagint. Jews translated the Septuagint around 200 BCE, when the land of Israel was part of the Hellenistic or Greek Empire. Later, Jews decided in the 1st century CE, after the fall of the temple, that the only authoritative language would be Hebrew. But Christians retained that authoritative Greek version of the Hebrew Bible as they composed new texts that ultimately were canonized as the New Testament, which is the other part of the Christian Bible. So the Hebrew Bible is much, much longer than the New Testament, and the Hebrew Bible is shared by both Jews and Christians. When Christians canonized it, though, they called it the Old Testament. Okay, so testament is another word for covenant. So it was a way of saying these texts and this version of the covenant had once been important, but that they had not been sufficient. They were not enough to save all people in the afterlife or in this life. But they did predict, according to Christian interpretation of hidden or cryptic meanings of the text, that Jesus would come as a new covenant to replace the old one. So that's why we can't use the name Old Testament to refer to the Jewish Bible. It's a Christian term specifically designed to discredit Jews and Judaism as a religious practice or having an ongoing covenant with God. Okay, so let's look at those 3 parts of the Jewish Bible first, the Tanakh. Okay, Torah means teachings, and we read from Genesis. Your other videos will help you think about some other books and the stories in them, or the texts in them, because sometimes it's not stories, it's more direct commandments, but those still have to be interpreted too. So the Torah is the oldest section and really the most authoritative. It's the most canonical part of the canon. And Genesis, for both Jews and Christians, contains many of the most important stories. So we read about Adam and Eve, their sons Cain and Abel, and then Seth. And then several generations later, Noah and the flood. But that is just the beginning of Genesis. That is the material that describes the creation of the whole world, and God's early frustration with humanity gone wrong. And so God basically, through the flood, does a second creation and starts over. But the rest describe a very specific covenant between Jews, or the people of Israel, and God. So Exodus in particular describes God saving the Hebrews from Egypt. So this would give a term to imagine them before they become a national kingdom. So God saves the Hebrews, brings them into the desert, and then brings them into the land God promised them, where they become the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of ancient Israel, as we might say. The prophetic texts, this middle part, describe the history of the kingdom of Israel. So from what might be around 1200 BCE until 200 BC, or no, I'm sorry. The latest texts and writings are from 200 BCE. Daniel is the latest text, although the plot of Daniel takes place earlier than 200 BCE. But these texts of the prophets, the latest is from about 515 BCE. So these prophets describe the relationship in authority between each king, who is called a Messiah, which means the anointed one, because the ceremony for each king to become initiated was for a prophet to pour oil on him. Okay, so literally, Messiah or Mashiach in Hebrew means the anointed one, and refers specifically to an earthly king, although from a very specific line, from the line of King David. However, while we can date these texts, they are not canonized in chronological order, particularly with the latter prophets. These are canonized first as Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, which are the three longest prophetic texts. Then we have the 12, which were all very short. They were canonized, but they were short. So they were all just written onto one scroll. Some are only maybe a few lines. So it didn't make sense to have a scroll with just like that scrap on it. And part of the reason they're canonized out of order is because ultimately, following the kingdom in chronological order, following that history, is not what's most important for them, for later interpreters. What's most important for them are two kinds of lessons, and both related to the covenant. One is the call to remember to perform ritual correctly, the rituals that God commands in the Torah, and then also the ethics of the Torah, particularly of Exodus and Deuteronomy. So the prophets, all of these prophets, especially the latter prophets, tell the Israelites that they should remember the importance of both the ritual commandments or mitzvot, as well as the ethical commandments or mitzvot. Mitzvah is the Hebrew word for commandment, and mitzvot is the plural. Okay, so some people think of the word mitzvah as just a good deed, but literally it means a commandment, and many of the good deeds that people might do would simply be commandments described in the Torah. Okay, so let's take a look then at some of the differences between what's in the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, and what's in these Christian canons. Okay, so the Catholic Bible and the Greek Orthodox Bible represent much older versions of the Christian canon. So you can see with all of them that have a star, for example, that there are texts here that are not in the Jewish version. But this doesn't mean that they're unimportant for Jewish life and practice. As I mentioned, when the Jewish rabbis canonized the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh in the 1st century, they decided Hebrew should be the only authoritative language. And so these texts are all in Hebrew, except for a little bit of Aramaic, which became the spoken language of Jews during the Babylonian exile from 586 to 515 BCE. The exile takes place, but actually Aramaic becomes the spoken language of Jews, of many Jews, all the way through the end of the Second Temple period, and even later for some. And then starting around 330 BCE, Greek also becomes a spoken language for Jews living anywhere within the Greek Empire. Okay, so Hebrew ceases to be the spoken language, the language in which everyday life is lived, but it becomes symbolic instead of Jewish identity. And many people, in particular, many Jewish men, continued to be able to read, even to speak in Hebrew, but it was a language of study and a language of liturgy, of ritual. Okay, so Daniel is a good example of a book that is moved in the Hebrew Bible. We see that it's here as a writing in the Jewish text, but in the version of the Hebrew Bible that's canonized by Christians, Daniel is moved to be a part of the prophetical books. Okay, so there's a slightly longer version of the text of Daniel, and that's canonized by the Orthodox Church, which doesn't really split into separate churches and for several hundred years after the early church is first created and makes a canon. So we can see that there's a big difference between calling Daniel a writing and calling it a prophetical book, right? That this actually, the place in the text where it's canonized influences how we read it, right? That if we read it as a writing, this is to say it's a fictional text. It's like reading a novel, one that helped Jews understand something about where they came from, as well as resisting new empires. But in the Christian canon, because it's moved to be a prophetical book, right, this suggests that it's some kind of nonfiction, right? That Daniel was a real person in the same way that we can confirm that these other people were really individual prophets with particular messages. So there's a big change in what the text of Daniel would mean, okay? So the difference between where things are canonized is important, as well as to realize that the Christian canon had various additional texts, right? We see the Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiasticus, which is another wisdom book yet. And these texts, like the Maccabees, right? I mentioned that some of what's canonized is remained important for Jews, even though they didn't canonize it in the Hebrew Bible. The Maccabees texts were probably written in Greek, or at any rate, if they were written in Hebrew, the Hebrew had already been lost by the 1st century CE. And so there were only Greek versions of the text, and therefore they weren't canonized. But these books tell the story of the historical event that is commemorated during the holiday of Hanukkah for Jews. Okay, so these texts were still read by Jews, still important to Jews, still informed Jewish holidays. Hanukkah, as we'll see, is a minor holiday in the Jewish ritual calendar. But in the United States, for example, it's become very important. In modern Israel, it has as well. Okay, so we have additional material and we have shifts of where books are that affect the genre, right? And then I want to talk about one last thing. In the Jewish Bible, we have the prophets in the middle. But as we can see in the Christian Bible, they are moved to the end. So if we look at that very last book, Malachi, Malachi means my messenger. Okay, so it's become a name that people might give their son. But originally it was an anonymous author. It's one of the latest texts in this canon. And Malachi just says that something really major is coming. Something major is going to happen that will change the whole world order, right? So that text is meaningful for Jews. It has a Jewish interpretation. It was Jewish before it was Christian, right? That Christians carry the Hebrew Bible with them. But the reason to put the prophetical books at the end of the Jewish canon is because if Christians read that message from Malachi, something major is about to change the world order. And then we imagine them turning the page of their Bible from Malachi to the beginning of the New Testament, which begins with the stories of Jesus that we'll study in the next segment when we study Christianity more in depth. That for Christians, this influenced an idea that the major thing Malachi was talking about was the coming of Jesus. Okay, so the canon also influences even the theological claims, right? With knowing very, very little, we can see that the canon is ordered in a very intentional way. So the texts are chosen in very intentional ways. They were debated. We see that Christianity includes more. We see that Christianity moves some books in terms of categorization, right? That there's no category called just a large category called prophets or just a large category called writings. Instead, the two are sort of crisscrossed and rearranged to create a total of 4 sections of the Christian Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. So we have the historical books, which describes something about how they are understood in the prophets to record some kind of history, even if for Jews that history is not the most important thing. You'll notice too that here Ruth appears as a historical book, whereas in the older Jewish canon, Ruth appears as a writing. So Ruth is also a work of fiction, but being moved into the place where the book takes place influences again how that book would be read, that it goes from being a writing, kind of like a novella, to being a historical book, right? So there's a revision of the very nature of these texts as they're canonized in Christianity. Okay, so what comes later, the very latest of all these canons, is the Protestant Bible. The Protestant Bible is created in the 16th century. Okay, so much, much later, we will read about the Protestant and discuss the Protestant Reformation. And Protestants imagined that what they could do was cut out the corruption of the Catholic Church and somehow return to life as it was in antiquity during Jesus' lifetime. So Protestants imagined that they were cutting through all the tradition which they believed was problematic. And that's why the Protestant Bible contains exactly the same books as the Hebrew Bible, However, it retained also the Christian order, right? We can see that it too has the order of the Pentateuch, or the five, right? Like like that beginning pent, right? That means five. So it's the first five books, and then the historical books, poetry, and then the prophets, right? And we see here that Daniel is added as a major prophet, as are the Lamentations, which were recorded as lamentations, books of, or chapters of sorrow, almost like hymns of sorrow, regretting both the destruction of the first temple, and Jews' punishment by God in exile. Okay, so these are works of really poetry, but they too are canonized as some kind of prophetic text in Christianity.